You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast. Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Common Descent, a podcast about paleontology, natural history, the history of life on Earth. This is episode 212. This episode's topic is Temnospondyls.
Yeah.
Temnospondyls are the famous group of ancient early tetrapods, or amphibians in a little bit of air quotes.
Yes.
Temnospondyls were one of the most important groups of life on land in the early history of land vertebrates, and also continuing into the early history of things like dinosaurs and the age of reptiles. They include a whole bunch of really cool, fascinating lizard-like and croc-like and salamander-like and even kind of frog-like creatures.
Yeah, they are surprisingly diverse. I think more diverse than most people who know about them might think.
God, they're more diverse than I thought.
Oh, yeah.
So in this episode, we will go over who the Temnospondyls are, the variety of body shapes and lifestyles that they achieved, what we know about their habits, their diets, all that kind of stuff. And, of course, we will talk about the grand mystery of their connection to modern-day amphibians. And we'll have a whole bunch of fun along the way. This episode topic, like all of our topics, was requested. This one was a popular one, requested by Thomas, Johann, Michael, Fran, The Ancient, Teoranosaurus, Lorena, Oswaldo, Jamie, Mathrove, Fred, James, Tracy, Ioselectus, Reed, Ginkgo Caudata, Taterboy, and Franco Speaks.
Our listeners have such fun names.
Well, it's very funny if you go back and listen through all of the episodes of the podcast and listen to our shout-outs of requesters. You can see when we started our Discord.
Yep.
When all of the weird usernames start popping up.
I love them. They're so much fun.
Thank you to all of those people who requested this topic. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you have a topic that you'd like to hear us talk about on the podcast, there is a form on our website that you could find a link down in the episode description. And hey, speaking of stuff you can find in the episode description, you can also find a link to our Patreon. Everything we do with this podcast is funded via Patreon, including the main episodes of the podcast, our fun spin-offs, and all of our cool new projects we have going on these days.
Yeah.
We are eternally grateful to our patrons. Patrons get bonus content and live streams and director's notes and all sorts of cool goodies, including, at a certain level, their names shouted out on the podcast when they join us. This episode, we would like to shout out and welcome to new patrons, Vince, Emily, and Marianne.
Thank you. Welcome. So exciting to have you.
Yes, indeed. Hey, if you want to be a patron and support our science communication efforts, check the links in the episode description. Also in the episode description, you can go fill out our listener survey. We're doing a survey to start off this year for the first time in quite a while. It will continue to be open until the middle of March. So if you are listening to this and you haven't filled that survey out yet, go check it out. We'll be able to announce some of the things we learned from that survey, including the results of the grand return of the poll.
The poll.
We'll see who wins this time. Also, go over to our YouTube channel on the YouTube to watch Bricks with Basque.
Yeah!
Our brand new video series where Will makes podcast and natural history themed Lego sets. By the time this episode comes out, there will be 2 Bricks with Basque episodes available.
Yeah, I doubled my output.
This month was a big month. The first episode was the geologic timescale. The second episode, the new one, is Turtles.
Turtles!
I really like the build you made
This
for Turtles.
is a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun with this one.
Also, at the end of March, we will be returning to ETS Yukon in Johnson City, Tennessee. On Sunday, March 30th, we will be part of 3 panels. One talking about dinosaurs in the real world, a la Jurassic World. One doing speculative evolution of Dungeons and Dragons monsters.
Yeah.
And the third one will be an Ask a Paleontologist panel with us and some of our friends from the Gray Fossil Site.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it every year. This is going to be a good one.
The day before that, Saturday, March 29th, we will be doing a meetup at the Gray Fossil Site and Museum. Anybody who is a fan of the podcast, who is or can be or will be in the area, is welcome to come say hi to us, hang out, see the museum, and maybe meet some of the people that we know at the museum as well. We will be there starting at noon on Saturday, March 29th. If you are thinking that you might be interested in coming and participating, hop on our Discord. We have a channel specifically for this where people can tell us that they're going to be there. If you're not on the Discord, you can send us an email just so that we have some idea of how many people we might expect to show up to something like this.
Yes.
We hope to see at least a handful of our fans there.
It'd be so much fun. Come spend the day with us.
Also, a very quick correction from the last episode, something that we got wrong. Turns out Meraxes is one of the Game of Thrones dragons.
Yeah.
It's just not one of the ones that is like in the story. It's like in the history of the world dragon. So my apologies to Astrid, who I told was wrong, who it turns out was not wrong. And my sincerest apologies to all of the deep lore Game of Thrones nerds out there who were quick to correct me on that. One more thing before we get into it. There's a lot going on out in the world, and there's a lot of people in need of information and support. So this episode, I'd like to shout out a couple more resources. One is the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on Human Rights. On their website, they have a whole bunch of resources for researchers and scholars who are facing job threats or harassment or loss of funding or any other problems that scientists might be running into at this time in the United States. We'll put a link in the episode description if you're interested in utilizing or supporting any of those resources. And another one I want to shout out is Erin in the Morning. I've been following Erin on social media for a while. Erin is a transgender journalist who reports on LGBTQ plus issues in the news, legislation, everyday life. On Erin's website, there's a bunch of resources for keeping up to date and finding support, and also fun stuff like a list of trans and non-binary Girl Scouts that you can buy cookies from.
Cool.
Very fun. Great place for resources and information. Also, link in the episode description. We hope everybody is doing okay out there.
Yes, yes.
Those are the announcements. It is time for the news. Every episode, we like to collect some news from the world of the sciences that interest us, keeps everybody up to date. Will, give us some news.
Happily. My first news is a mathematical study projection investigating the hypothesis of dogs self-domesticating themselves and whether or not the time span that would have had to happen is enough for that event to have occurred.
All right, interesting.
Yeah. This is research by David Elzinga et al. In the Proceedings of the Royal Society B Biological Sciences, and the article is a press release by Bob Yurka in phys.org. So famously, at one point in history, wolves started interacting with us humans, and eventually we domesticated them and then started breeding them for different jobs and to better help us in survival in day-to-day life. The current estimates and projections have that we probably began living in close proximity together, so interacting around-ish 30,000 years ago. And for the past 15,000 years, we've been having dogs, breeding dogs, fully domesticated dogs. How that happened has been a topic of quite some discussion. It's not clear whether it happened once or multiple times. It's not clear whether it was an active effort by humans to domesticate, to select wolves that would be more favorable to live with or live near, or whether it was kind of a process that just sort of happened as wolves approached human societies, if they kind of domesticated themselves, so to speak, that by them coming to take advantage of our trash heaps or our extra food, they selected in themselves the more friendly members that would be less threatening and could approach human society more easily.
Right, that they adapted to human society before humans started actually selectively breeding dogs.
Exactly. One major critique of that self-domestication hypothesis is that it would have had to happen in that first 15,000 years before we had dogs, and many have said that's not enough time for that kind of natural selection process to occur. Just too fast. It has to have been active effort on humans selecting friendly wolf pups and raising them near human society. The researchers wanted to test, is that true? Is that not enough time? So they used mathematical models. These are models that can simulate evolutionary processes, and you can select different parameters and different variables to try to get a fairly realistic estimate of the rate and time frame that certain evolutionary processes would take. They focused on the evolution of a single trait, a measure of human tolerance in the wolves. This is also able to track evolutionary changes over time. So like more tame wolves breeding with other more tame wolves and how that would affect the rate of it happening. They also were able to allow for variable amounts of food coming from humans as tameness increased. And they tested scenarios both with and without mate preference so that they could test whether sexual selection would have played a role or if it wasn't playing a role. They ran the simulations mimicking those 15,000 years it would have to happen in, and they found that wolves evolved into dogs 37 to 74% of the time in these models. So it doesn't seem like for sure it would happen in that time.
But some version of this is mathematically possible.
Yes, it
within
does,
that time frame.
Exactly. It does seem that using that time frame as a reason to reject that hypothesis is not valid enough.
Right. This is one of those interesting... Like, we had a news that was similar to this not too long ago. I forget what it was. But that this isn't actually providing any direct support that this is what happened, but it is saying it is a possibility.
Yeah.
We can't reject it for the time scale reason.
Exactly. They said in some of the scenarios it could have happened as quickly as 8,000 years.
All right.
So based off of these models, so unless there's something grossly wrong with the models they're using, or someone comes along and goes, ooh, actually, you didn't carry the two.
Right. Or we find a domesticated dog that's 10,000 years earlier.
Exactly. This does seem to say that we can't write off the self-domestication hypothesis. That does seem to be a valid scenario that could have happened.
Yeah. This is these kind of studies are a fun way to emphasize that there are many different ways to approach a scientific hypothesis.
Yes.
That anytime there's an idea of what might have happened in some part of evolutionary history or anything in science, we look for as many reasons as we can to either support or reject it.
Yes.
And oftentimes it takes a study like this to say, all right, here's this one potential point of rejection. Let's see if that works. Because if it does one way or the other, we can now take this criticism off the board.
Yes.
Potentially.
We don't have to account for it in our discussion anymore because it turns out not to have been a valid point. As you put, it still could absolutely be like, nope, we did actively domesticate them.
Oh, sure.
This is not saying that the wolves definitely domesticated themselves, but we should not stop looking into that scenario.
Yeah. If we want to disprove that, we need to do it a different way.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is very cool. Well, my first bit of news is also about when a group of animals first became the group of animals that we like to think of them as. In this case, a new fossil species that pushes up the origin of recognizable birds.
Ooh.
This is research by Runsheng Chen et al. In Nature, and we will link in the blog post to an article in Smithsonian Magazine by Margarita Bassi. So birds showed up around the late Jurassic period. Based on fossils and genetic evidence, it's estimated that true birds evolved somewhere around 160 million years ago. But the bird fossil record is pretty much exclusively after the Jurassic.
Yeah.
So during the late part of the Jurassic period, birds appear to have already evolved, but we don't have a lot of fossils of those very earliest birds. There are a handful of fossils from that time that are maybe birds, maybe close to birds. The only fossil from the late Jurassic that is generally agreed upon to be a bird is Archaeopteryx.
Yes.
And even then, there has been some question as to where on the bird family tree does Archaeopteryx actually fall, or should it actually be just next to it? So we don't have a lot, we have very little in the way of late Jurassic birds. This study provides a description of a late Jurassic bird.
How convenient.
This is very exciting. And also, it is not just like maybe a bird, it's a bird.
Bird.
This fossil comes from the Zhenghe fauna of southeastern China. It dates to around 149 million years ago, so it's several million years before the end of the Jurassic. It is a new genus and species, which they have named Bamminornis zhengheensis. It is about the size of a quail, so not very... Archaeopteryx is also quite small.
Yeah.
The fossil includes most of the skeleton, although no skull.
Okay.
Which is a bit of a shame, but most of the skeleton. It appears to be, despite its early age, a true bird. The shoulder and the hips are very bird-like. The hands, they noted, are more like other theropod dinosaurs, so less bird-like. Most surprisingly, and this is the thing that is making like the headlines and also the title of the paper, I think, it has a short tail.
I was wondering.
It has that short... So this is a iconic feature of bird evolution, is that Archaeopteryx and other near birds have that long dinosaurian tail, but early on in bird evolution, they shortened it down to birds today have a pygostyle,
Yes.
which is a little anchor that holds onto the tail feathers. This is a bird that has some more ancestral features, has some more bird-like features, but the tail is a bird-like tail.
Fascinating.
This is really interesting because not only is this an early part of the transition to more modern bird features, but it shows that certain features showed up way earlier than we thought that they had shown up.
Yeah.
This makes Bamminornis the earliest known short-tailed bird by about 20 million years, which is quite a jump for pushing back when that feature showed up. Depending on where other fossils fall out, Bamminornis might end up being the oldest known true bird, right? If Archaeopteryx is considered near bird versus if it is considered properly within the bird lineage, Bamminornis is one of the earliest. And it also suggests that the early evolution and diversification of birds not only happened in the late Jurassic, as was already suspected, but might have gotten started earlier in the late Jurassic.
Yeah.
Might have happened more rapidly in the late Jurassic. This makes it seem like Jurassic birds might not have just been a bunch of almost birds. There might have actually just been birds in the late Jurassic.
And it's so fascinating because, either we're missing a longer portion that it took a while for them to get here and they started earlier, or if it happened fast, that feels like a dramatic thing to happen, that like you got rid of basically an entire tail in a potentially short amount of time. And when then that raises the questions of what drove that to happen so fast?
Yeah.
I don't want to jump on the typical bird bandwagon of, was it because of flying? Did you need that was that a super helpful thing to do to make you better at flying? But it does raise those questions. Yeah,
well, and it also makes you wonder, are there other near birds that were already doing that?
Exactly, yeah.
Is this a bird feature, or were there non-birds that were very close that already started the reduction of the tail?
Yeah, because there's other theropods, like the oviraptors have a very shortened tail and they have big prominent tail feathers. Could this be a feature that was really useful for something, and it was just a really strong evolutionary driver to shorten down the tail? Cool.
Yep, more mysteries of bird evolution.
Neat. My next bit of news is not about birds, but they get referenced a lot because it's about the evolution or the process of Earth life becoming colorful.
Okay.
Asking the questions of was the pattern of coloration coming to be, and what order did certain things happen in. This is research by John Weens and Zachary Emberts in the Cambridge Philosophical Society, and the article is by Jonathan Goldenberg in The Conversation. So this research is looking into the fact that, there's tons of colorful things in nature, plants, animals, lots of bright, dazzling colors, warning signs, sexual display signs, and, flowers being colorful to attract pollinators. This study was looking at the fact that it's often thought that these colorful displays are utilizing pre-existing sensitivities to color, our vision being able to see color, but then that raises the question of, if they are responding to color vision, what was the original purpose of color vision? Were animals colorful before we had color vision, or did we get color vision and then start becoming colorful? Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, why? So this is a review. They went and reviewed various researches to get an idea of the overall timing of different coloration patterns and color vision, specifically focusing on color vision, fruits, flowers, aposematic coloration, which is warning patterns, and sexual selected coloration. They found, based on their review, that the first bursts of coloration come from plants, not surprising, that early plants began producing likely colorful fruits and flowers, probably to attract seed dispersers and things like that, and that based off of their models, it suggested that colorful fruits of some kind appeared around 300 to 377 million years ago. Within, colorful flowers coming around 140 to 250 million years ago. The first warning colorations that were widely distributed across animals based off of their review is younger than might be expected. They had it at evolving in the last 150 million years. I didn't see which reviews they're looking at, so what this research is exactly based off of, but they had that around then, and sexual selection colors also came out as relatively young based off their review in less than 100 million years ago. This all preceded by color vision likely evolving somewhere between 400 to 500 million years ago.
Okay.
So it does seem, based off this review, that animals evolved color vision before most of the colorful traits that this review seems to indicate would have evolved by.
Yeah, that one way or another, it seems the capability to detect different colors through vision is more ancestral, older than the ability to produce a variety of colors in the body.
Yeah, and so this does sync up with the Cambrian explosion.
Sure.
So it's very likely that color vision just came about with increasing vision during a predator-prey response that the Cambrian explosion is so famous for. But this timing, they made a point that I thought was kind of interesting, that based off of the situation, it does suggest that colorful life was not a inevitable thing. It came about after we could see color.
Yeah.
That maybe without color vision, animals and plants might have been a much duller color throughout Earth history. That we see it come about after the ability to see it is a thing, not beforehand.
It's interesting because it sounds like the implication of this is that the use of coloration as communication is something that came about later on, right?
Yes.
The use of fruits or flowers or warning colors or whatnot, taking advantage of the fact that animals can see those colors. But the ability to see colors was useful before these organisms were putting it to communicative use, which makes plenty of sense because there's lots of reasons that things can be colorful without the benefit of communication. We've talked before about pigments. Pigments in the skin have functions beyond just producing color. Melanin, for example, is a structural molecule. It helps to provide additional, often to provide protection for the skin or things like that. So it would make perfect sense to me that in the Cambrian, when eyes were first showing up, episode 68, there would have been a variety of colors in the ecosystem just because animals and environment were made out of different materials.
Yes.
So the ability to resolve different colors would have been useful for navigating, for finding food, for whatever. And then once that ability is there, because as we've talked about before, the ability to see a variety of colors seems to be very ancestral to vertebrates.
Yep.
Like fish, amphibians, reptiles are all really good at it. So probably among the earliest animals that made it onto land were already good at spotting a variety of colors.
Yes.
So then it isn't surprising that plants and animals would end up taking advantage of that.
Yeah. So yeah, just an interesting concept that I'd never really given any thought to.
Very fun. Well, my last bit of news is also about broad-scale evolutionary patterns. In this case, the relationship between large herbivores and seeds.
Makes sense.
And how changes in one will change the other, and what it means for our own evolutionary history.
Ooh.
This one's pretty cool. This is research by Christopher Doty et al. In Paleontology, and in the blog post we will link to an article in Cosmos by Evrim Yazgin. Large herbivores tend to be what we call ecosystem engineers. They change the shape of the ecosystem around them simply by being there.
Yep.
They knock down trees, they clear paths in the forest, they clear the plants that are in the undergrowth. An elephant or a herd of rhino, well, flip those, or a bunch of dinosaurs are going to cause a lot of changes to the structure of their ecosystem. It has been hypothesized in the past that mass extinctions of large herbivores would lead to denser forests.
Yeah.
Because you're missing those engineers. Denser forests would mean darker forest floors and changes in the composition of the plants. This study aims to quantify that with ecological models that aim to replicate the shape of forests across the Cenozoic era.
Cool.
The last 66 million years. They build models incorporating the sizes of herbivores, the sizes of seeds. So the seed size comes in here because closed canopies are predicted to lead to larger seeds.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Because if there's less light, a larger seed, it has the capability to have a larger energy store.
Yes.
Because you're essentially getting less food, so they need to be able to hold their own for longer.
Well, and I know a bunch of them also have to, wait until a break in the canopy can allow them to go, so you have to be able to sit on a food store for longer.
Yes, so it's predicted that as a forest gets denser, you will see larger seeds developing to withstand the darker understory.
Cool.
So this they took all this information, looking at what we have in the fossil record, what the model would predict to happen as herbivores go extinct, and put it from the Paleocene all the way to the Holocene. And what they found was the model predicts a rapid increase in the size of seeds in the early Paleocene, right after the Cretaceous mass extinction, and in the early Holocene after the late Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions. And they note that increase in seed size matches what we see in the fossil record.
Nice.
We do see that increase in seed size. This model supports the idea that it is related to those extinctions. It supports the idea that there is a relationship between large herbivores and the size of seeds. It also shows a reverse of that situation predicted to happen around 35 million years ago, when mammals start evolving into large herbivores.
Yeah.
And we get the reverse.
Very cool.
Now, they point out that their model is very simplified. There's a lot of factors that are not worked out in detail. There's a lot of uncertainty, but it shows that changing seed size can be explained by changes to the environment around it, and specifically that it can change just in relation to changes in the herbivores around, without having to bring up anything like climate changes or tectonic shifts. It could happen just because the herbivores changed.
Yeah.
They also point out, and this is what the headlines say, that this has implications for the evolution of the things that live in the forests. The specific example that they follow up with is that bigger seeds often have bigger fruit. So it's possible that after the extinction of lots of large herbivores, you get a denser forest with larger fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And they point out that that means that it could be that the extinction of dinosaurs might have set the stage for the early success of our primate ancestors who were fruit eaters.
Yeah.
That it might be that in the wake of the dinosaur extinction, among the changes that happened to ecosystem is that fruits got bigger and that early primates might have been able to take advantage of that. And that might have been one more boost to help our lineage get started.
Cool.
It also, they point out, has important implications for what's happening in our ecosystems today.
Yep.
As we are changing the shape of our various forests and other things, how that's going to affect plants and the animals that rely on them.
Yeah, well, and this is also such a great example of a thing we've talked about before, but it's so easy to forget that the plant biome, the what often gets seen as the background, is not separate from the animals living in it. Of course, we know that the animals rely on the plants, but the shape of that plant ecosystem is heavily reliant on the animals living in it because they shape it, they disperse seeds, they are a huge part of why it is the way it is in that moment.
Yeah.
So yeah, removing an animal can change what kind of forest you have.
Yeah.
And I don't think we typically connect it that strongly.
Well, this is also an interesting study because we talk a lot about how it's so difficult to determine what factors are related to what other factors. And a study like this allows us to build a model that specifically isolates these things in the environment and says, in the absence of anything else, do these two things affect each other?
Yes.
And the answer in this case is, yeah, they do. Apparently quite strongly.
Yep. Which is very cool.
Indeed. That's the news. And so now we shall move on to our main discussion topic of the episode. We're going to talk about Temnospondyls, the fossil record's most impressive group of ancient amphibians. We're going to take a short break, and after this musical interlude, we'll get started with meeting these cool amphibians. Woo! Fish gave rise to the first land-dwelling vertebrate animals in the Devonian period.
Mm-hmm.
From there, those early tetrapods, right? Tetrapod, 4 feet, vertebrates on land, diversified into a whole variety of amphibian-esque creatures.
Like, definitely amphibic. Like, they were
amphibious.
Yes, amphibious.
Whether they were amphibian is a little bit. These include those really, really early ones like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, which were more fish than anything else. And then a whole bunch of other groups, the Colosteids, the Embolamirs, the Lepospondals. Some of these were more like those fish, like Sarcopterygian fish that they had descended from. Others were closer to amniotes, the group that would eventually include reptiles and mammals, things with hard-shelled eggs and such. There was this whole variety of stuff in between fish and amniotes that are generally pointed at as the late Paleozoic amphibian variety. These came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some of them were like salamanders or lizards. Some of them were croc-like. A lot of them were eel-like. The Colosteids included eel-like animals like Greerpeton, which were secondarily aquatic. They had reverted into water. Lepospondals included things like Diplocaulus, the one with the weird boomerang head.
My favorite.
As well as the Astepods, which were long and limbless, like snakes, which might have been the first vertebrates to do the snake thing. Among this diversity, there were also the Temnospondyls. This is one of the particular groups of these early Paleozoic amphibians. Temnospondyls stand out for a number of reasons, but among them, they were the most diverse tetrapods outside of amniotes. Before the first reptile ancestors showed up, Temnospondyls were doing the best out on land. One of the first well-known examples of a temnospondyl is Mastodonsaurus from the Triassic. Apparently, I think this was on the Wikipedia page. It mentioned that Cuvier, I think, argued that it shouldn't be called Mastodonsaurus because that was too similar to Mastodon, and that would be confusing for people. That didn't happen. It stuck. Mastodonsaurus from the Triassic of Europe. Mastodonsaurus is large and very croc-like. It looks like kind of a big crocodile. Its skull is broad and flat. The body is quite long. It has relatively small legs and feet. Very crocodilian-like.
Yeah, as we've said before, these were really the first ones to do this body shape.
Yes. In the 1800s, when it and other temnospondyls and early tetrapods were first being researched, many of them were identified as reptiles. And they were also grouped under a bunch of different names. One of the early names was labyrinthodonts, which referred to the complex folding of the dental tissues. The term stegocephalians, which means roof-headed because they have those wide, flat heads. Over time, these different groups were phylogenetically sorted, and we started to figure out these are lepispondylls, these are temnospondyls, this and this. And they were eventually recognized as being not reptiles, but amphibians. Amphibians in the broad sense of non-amniote tetrapods.
Yes.
So today we have amphibians. Frogs, salamanders, and caecilians are the only non-amniote tetrapods that we have. They are also one relatively closely grouped clade. During the late Paleozoic, there were just tons of these non-amniote tetrapods around. Our modern amphibians, are the group Lysamphibia, are descended from these early Paleozoic amphibian groups. We will talk more about that later because this is another thing that temnospondyls are famous for, is probably being the ancestors of our modern amphibians.
Neat.
These days, there are around 300 species of temnospondyls that are known. They're found on all continents around the world, from the late Paleozoic into the early Mesozoic. Like a lot of the other early tetrapods, they tend to be croc-shaped or salamander-shaped, long bodies. They often have very large heads.
Yeah, they do.
Like fish.
Yes.
Like when you look at a fish and the head just takes up a disproportionate amount of the body.
Yeah, it's like a quarter of their mass.
Yeah. Temnospondyls tended to be rather large head, not ridiculously so. Again, kind of the way that crocs are, but without the neck
Yes.
that crocs have. Crocs have a neck, and temnospondyls had much more of that fish shape to them.
The thing it always makes me think of is the Japanese and Chinese salamanders.
Yeah.
Which have very wide head and are very temnospondyls shaped.
They are the closest we have to modern temnospondyls.
Yup.
Many temnospondyls were aquatic, semi-aquatic, some living most of their time in water, others more amphibious. Aquatic temnospondyls tend to share a bunch of specific features. They tend to have long bodies, they have small legs, they often have grooves along the skull that are linked to the lateral line system.
That's what I was wondering.
Which fish, famously today, have the lateral line as a way of sensing changes in the water around them.
Cool.
Aquatic temnospondyls some of them have bones of the throat system, the hyobranchial system, that show evidence for internal gills in some of them, which we see in fish. Others, we have soft tissue that shows evidence of external gills, like an axolotl or something, as well as fins along the back or the tail. Many of them, the tail is compressed, sort of flat side to side, which is helpful for swimming.
Yeah, like a newt's.
Yes. So aquatic temnospondyls, we see a lot of these features that both tell us that they were aquatic and are very fish-like. On the other hand, we have a bunch of temnospondyls that were terrestrial, that spent all or most of their time out of the water. They tend to have more robust and well-built limbs. They show no evidence of the gills or the lateral line system because you're not in the water. Some of them also have armor, scaly or osteoderm armor. Overall, temnospondyls were generally pretty big. They were commonly 1 to 2 meters long, so similar to crocs and gators today.
Yeah.
The smallest ones were little aquatic guys that were 5 to 10 centimeters.
Wow.
So, like a salamander. Like
Yeah.
really little. And the biggest ones, Mastodonsaurus being one of them, could be over 5 meters long, which is also like modern crocodiles.
Yep.
And in fact, they are, as far as we know, the largest non-amniote tetrapods.
That makes sense.
There are fish larger than that,
Mm-hmm.
and there are reptiles and mammals that eventually that would get larger than that. But outside of amniotes and fish, tetrapods, these were the biggest that they got.
Cool.
Was saltwater croc-sized.
Absolutely.
Big animals.
Oh, that's so awesome.
They're very cool. So let's take a little tour through the deep history of Temnospondyls. The oldest examples of this group are found in the early Carboniferous period, around 330 million years ago, not very long after fish came out of the sea. These include members like Balanerpaton, which is known from Germany a lot. You're going to hear Germany a lot in this episode. Germany is a great place for Temnospondyls. Balanerpaton is about 40 centimeters long, so a little over a foot. Very salamander-like. It is found in lakes, in what were ancient lakes in a woodland. There's another one from Scotland, which is also small, has evidence of that lateral line system, so presumably more aquatic, lived in a swamp. This is how Temnospondyls kind of got their start. Many Temnospondyls were terrestrial, amphibious creatures living in swamps and forests. I saw one paper mentioned that there are a bunch of early Temnospondyls known from tree trunks, like the stumps of trees.
Yeah.
So these were living in these forests. Temnospondyls appear to have started out terrestrial.
Yeah. Yep.
They were amphibious because they were still tied to the water, and many of them were swimmers and swamp dwellers, but they were continental on-land animals. By the Permian period, they became very diverse.
Mm-hmm.
And there are several major groups within Temnospondyls that begin to diversify and radiate during the Permian. I am not going to go into all of the different groups because I thought about it. I started making the list of them, and they're really, I don't want to say they're all the same.
Yeah.
But they're kind of all, I don't have like distinguishing features to talk about every one of them.
Yes. Well, it's like when we do news about a new species, and it's like, how did they tell it was a new species? And like its eye was shaped weird.
Yes.
Like
Some of these
I can't
have
actually describe it.
weird shaped bones.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to highlight a couple of particularly divergent groups, one of which, especially during the Carboniferous and Permian, was really popular, are the Disaurophoroids. These are interesting for a couple of reasons. One, they were typically small.
Okay.
These were probably insect eaters or eating other small animals, whereas other Temnospondyls were mainly eating fish, maybe other small vertebrates. Some of the Disaurophoroids were terrestrial predators. These tended to be a bit more robust and stocky. Some of them were almost toad-like in their shape. Not quite, they weren't hopping around, but they have that sort of general body
That's
shape.
squat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of them would be up to about a meter long. That's about as big as this group got. At least one of them, Platyhystrix, had a sail on its back like Dimetrodon. I don't have any more information about that, but I didn't know that, and that's
Where
very
are
cool.
all our modern sailbacked animals? Like,
I don't know.
What's
They all left. They left us in the Mesozoic. Disaurophoroids also included some aquatic groups, Micromolerpatontids and Brachiosaurs, which tended to be less than a foot long. These
Gotcha.
were little guys. These are an interesting group because they demonstrate the diversity of Temnospondyls at the time. These, with their variety of lifestyles and sizes. Also, this is the group that modern amphibians are typically linked to.
Oh.
More on that later. Over the course of the Permian, there is a gradual decline in terrestrial Temnospondyls. The land-dwelling Temnospondyls start to just sort of shrink and vanish away, probably as a result of two things. One, it was getting drier.
Mm-hmm.
As we move into the Permian, things got very dry as Pangea is coming together, and that's bad if you're an amphibian. But also because at the same time, we're seeing the diversification of amniotes. the early members of the reptile and mammal lineage, and they were way better at being on land than the Temnospondyls were.
Yeah, when it's much harder for you to dry out, that sure does help a lot.
You got eggs that can survive up there. By the Triassic period, there were very few Temnospondyls left in terrestrial environments. There weren't really a lot of land dwellers, but there were still tons of aquatic species
Okay.
among Temnospondyls, especially among a particular group called Stereospondylus,
Oh, yeah.
which is another name that I think has come up on the podcast before. Stereospondylus are kind of the face of Temnospondyls in the Mesozoic. These were extremely diverse and successful. They were large predators in lakes and streams, also lagoons, so freshwater but also brackish water along coastlines. They were often the top predators in Triassic bodies of water.
Cool.
So in the Triassic, when synapsids are doing wild stuff, dinosaurs are just getting started, if you visited a lake, Temnospondyls is what you might have to look out for.
Neat.
They were super diverse. One paper mentioned that some Triassic lakes are known to have had several different Stereospondyle species, occupying different niches within the same lake environment. Stereospondylus were typically croc-shaped, again, long bodies, flat heads. Some of them had very long, wide snouts, like we think of with alligators. This included groups like Capitosaurs, which includes Mastodonsaurus from before, the giant ones. But there were also the Plagiosaurids, which were highly aquatic. Their skulls are super weird. They're very short and very flat. Their whole body is super flat. These were bottom dwellers in lakes and rivers and stuff. They were also covered in armor.
Ooh.
So these were like, I'm picturing like a mata turtle.
Yeah.
Down at the bottom, well protected. Stereospondylus also included a group called Traumattosaurs, which had long, slender snouts, not like an alligator, but more like a gharial. And these were marine. These were ocean-dwelling Temnospondyls, the only ones, apparently, that became properly ocean-dwelling.
Cool.
These are found in ocean deposits.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And once again, going in the ocean, getting a long snout. What is?
We're going to talk about that more later. I've got stuff on diet and feeding that we'll get into. So during the late Paleozoic, Temnospondyls originally diversified into a bunch of different groups, on land, in the water, all the in-betweens. Moving into the Triassic, they mostly left land ecosystems, but diversified into yet many more groups in aquatic ecosystems, even in marine ecosystems. I often, in my head, I have Temnospondyls logged as a Paleozoic group.
Yes, same.
But they were extremely diverse and successful during the Triassic period, as the age of reptiles was getting started.
Which just makes the Triassic all the more... It's such an interesting mixture of creatures.
Yeah, it's this melange of Paleozoic and Mesozoic bits.
Yes. Oh.
However, the end Triassic mass extinction, episode 15, was bad times for Temnospondyls. Lots of groups got hit really hard by this extinction, including a lot of the early crocodiliforms and dinosaur cousins. Temnospondyls were also among those. Very few groups survive into the Jurassic. Some of them do.
Okay.
There are Temnospondyl survivors. The youngest known Temnospondyls in the fossil record are a species from the early Cretaceous. Some of them made it quite a ways.
Wow.
Around 120 million years ago, named Koolasuchus from Victoria in Australia.
Pretty cool.
Pretty cool. This was a stereospondyl.
Nice.
There are several fragments known of it. It appears to have been quite large, up to 3 meters long.
Wow.
So still gator-sized. Aquatic, big wide head. It's just carrying on the classic stereospondal lifestyle and body shape. As late as the early Cretaceous. That is, as far as we know, as late as Temnospondyls made it. Unless Amphibia is also part of Temnospondyls.
Yes.
In which case, frogs, salamanders, and Sicilians, and Albinurbitantids are later surviving Temnospondyls.
Yeah, the birds of Temnospondyls.
Absolutely. Maybe. More on that later.
That's awesome. I, like you said, I definitely had them logged in my brain as a Permian thing. Like that's when if you asked me, that's the time period I thought of.
Yes.
I wasn't surprised that they made it into the Triassic, because
Yeah.
that makes sense. There's not anything that immediately is going to push, like there were phytosaurs, but those aren't going to just push out the entire group.
Sure. Yeah, reptiles are starting to move into a lot of those niches that Temnospondyls are in. But yeah, it's not like they're all gone immediately.
Yes. So like that made sense. I'm blown away that they made it to the Cretaceous.
Yeah.
I had no clue that was true.
I didn't even know they were so successful in the Triassic.
Yeah.
That the Permian and Triassic were the heyday of Temnospondyls.
Yeah, no, I wasn't surprised. I did not know that was another famous period for them.
Yeah. So there were full-on proper Temnospondyls, like like Mastodonsaurus and Coolosuchus style Temnospondyls. I had to check if it was cool, because a lot of them are named Suchus.
Yes.
Which is crocodile.
Yep.
Temnospondyls get a lot of Suchus and Saurus.
Yes, they do.
Which are crocs and reptiles, but also a lot of Erpatons.
Yes.
Which is a classic early tetrapod suffix. Yeah, Greerpaton and Balanerpaton. But yeah, there were proper good old-fashioned Temnospondyls interacting with stegosaurs and stuff.
And that's so, like, they've always been a famous group, because they're the famous first big tetrapods.
Yeah. They're the face of Paleozoic amphibians.
Yes. And so, like, but in my head, that they always were the step between. It's like, all right, we descended from fish, and then there were fishy things, and then they were the next step, and then
we took a short break in the world of amphibians, but then we very quickly developed into reptiles, which was better.
And the fact that it's like, no, they were right alongside the reptiles for a long time.
Yeah, Temnospondyls from Balanerpaton to Coolosuchus is over 200 million years of time on the planet, which is more than the non-bird dinosaurs managed.
Which now puts them right on the list of things of like, well, why couldn't we have those now?
Yeah.
That would be so cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, they were around for about as long as crocodiliforms have been around. So like this was a very successful group of animals.
So cool.
Tons of Temnospondyl fossils are known from all around the world. There are a bunch of famous examples here in the U.S. Places like Mason Creek have them. There's a bunch of really famous sites in Europe, especially in Germany. Germany came up a whole bunch because there's a lot of these really time-appropriate sites that were ancient lakes and stuff that have Temnospondyl ecosystems. There are Temnospondyls from Africa. There are Temnospondyls in the Karoo Basin.
Yay!
Episode 208. Australia, like Coolosuchus. These were all over the place. Because of that extensive fossil record, we also have a pretty extensive amount of data on the lifestyles of Temnospondyls. So we're going to take a short break, and then when we come back, we'll explore all sorts of facets of Temnospondyl behavior and habitats and lives and stuff, and life cycles.
Yay!
Oh, excited to get to that. Stay tuned. Let's begin our exploration of Temnospondyl biology on the outside.
Woo!
We have a bunch of soft tissue remains for Temnospondyls that have shown us what their outer integument and some of their organs looked like. We know that most Temnospondyls were scaly. They had scales, generally round scales over the back. They tended to have longer scales, chevron-shaped scales along the belly. Some of them had osteoderms, skin bones, often across the back. Plagiosaurs, those bottom-dwelling, lake-living stereospondyls, had plate-like armor of osteoderms across their backs, I think also on their heads. This is another place where thinking of them as amphibians is misleading, because modern amphibians are not like this.
Yeah.
These would have looked very reptilian. in their body covering, their skin and scales.
They even though they're kind of shaped like salamanders, and even though they may be the origin for our modern amphibians,
and they were amphibious.
Yes, and they are
they didn't lay hard-shelled eggs.
Mm-hmm. And they're the early descendants of fish that came onto land. It's not just that first there was fish, then amphibians, then reptiles, then mammal. Like, it's not actually that neat. These were fundamentally different.
Yes. Now, not all Temnospondyls were very scaly. Several different groups are known to have reduced their scalation. Again, lots of soft tissues. Some groups, the scales became thinner. So they had scales, but they were just less thick. Others, they covered less of the body. And some groups appear to have lost scales completely, like our modern amphibians are not scaly. This reduction in scales typically shows up in aquatic groups. Many of the stereospondyls were less scaly or smaller species.
Okay.
Like the littlest disaurophoroids. This could be related to flexibility, that if you're going to be swimming in the ocean, you need to be able to move your body a bit more freely, so reducing the scales and osteoderms and stuff is important. We see that in marine reptiles.
Yes.
We talked about that last episode with the plesiosaurs news.
Yep.
That plesiosaurs seem to have reduced their scales. It could also be related to breathing. Modern amphibians perform cutaneous respiration. They are exchanging gases through their skin. We do not do this, but amphibians and some reptiles do this a little bit. It is very likely that some early amphibians like Temnospondyls could do at least some of this, but bigger animals are going to have a much harder time getting any benefit from skin breathing.
Yes.
Because the amount of skin you have to the amount of body you have to fuel has become too great a ratio.
Yes.
Which is partly why all of our amphibians today that do skin breathing are very small.
Yep. And it makes me wonder also if that was something they were doing, were they slimy?
Yeah.
Like, how amphibian-like was your skin? Or were you just smooth-skinned? Was there not actually any of the softness, the almost jelly-like texture that some amphibians have?
Well, and if you were slimy, were you also poisonous? Because amphibians are really good at secreting things through their skin. A lot of those help to keep them moisturized or help to facilitate respiration through the skin. But that system is extremely convenient for also producing toxins.
Yep.
So tons of frogs and salamanders are poisonous using that same system. Were Temnospondyls poisonous? Especially the little, the tiny ones that were going to get eaten all the time. Were they brightly colored?
Yes, exactly.
Were they like poison dart frog colored little Temnospondyls?
It makes sense.
Incidentally, there is at least one example of the skin color pattern known. This is a branchiosaurid, which is one of the disaurophoroids, called Melanerpeton from Germany. Early Permian, that preserves a pattern of spots on the skin. So it was similar to some modern salamanders. It had sort of a spotty pattern.
Neat.
Another thing that I didn't expect to be able to weigh in on is researchers have noted that a lot of Temnospondyls, the inner ear structure is most similar to frogs.
Okay.
And some researchers have suggested that Temnospondyls probably had a tympanum, like frogs do. That when you look at a frog's head, there's that circle on the side of the head behind the eyes that is their eardrum, essentially.
Yes, exactly.
So a lot of Temnospondyls probably had that frog-like eardrum.
Cool.
Speaking of the skin and the outer appearance, without the skin, which is how most of our Temnospondyls come, their skull bones and their osteoderms look a lot like crocodile bones.
Yeah.
They've got that pitting and ridges and furrows, that very sculptured outer shape of those bones.
The rugosity.
It's
one of my favorite words.
Crocs have this. A lot of other early tetrapods have this as well, not just Temnospondyls. We've talked about this with crocs, the question of what is this for? This has also been investigated in Temnospondyls. There is evidence that these bones had extensive vascularization, so lots of blood vessels passing through and over and around them. This could be related to their respiration.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that those vessels, the sculpturing of it is somehow enhancing their ability to take in gases.
Yeah, adding surface area or something.
It could be related to thermoregulation, to taking in and releasing heat, which I know has also been suggested for crocs.
Mm-hmm.
Another hypothesis that I came across that I thought was really interesting, and that specifically relates to Temnospondyls in a way that I don't think relates to crocs, is that the vessels along these bones might be taking up minerals from the bone as a way of offsetting the effects of buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood.
Oh.
That certain minerals in the bone can help buffer when the blood gets too full of carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
This apparently is a problem that like lungfish run into, because they are really good at breathing and regulating their systems in the water. But when they move into air, their respiratory system doesn't work quite as efficiently, so they can end up with a buildup of carbon dioxide. A study in 2012 found that the sculpturing of the bones in Temnospondyls is more pronounced in the terrestrial species than in the aquatic species, or smaller species.
Okay.
And it might be that either in the water or just having a small body, respiration, that skin-breathing system especially, is just more efficient.
Yes.
So it might also be partly an adaptation to living on land.
Yeah.
And managing your body chemistry the way that you need to. So there isn't a single clear answer to what that sculpturing is for. This I thought was really interesting because that feels like something that would be different from what crocs are using it for.
Which, to my knowledge, if someone knows a croc research out there that's cracked it, we also don't know why crocs have that texture.
We have a lot of good hypotheses.
Mm-hmm. There's lots of things that it probably helps with, like the osteoderms probably are helping with soaking up heat from the sun. There's been thoughts that maybe the skull is helping them be more stealthy in the water by roughing up the surface to reduce their wake.
Yep. Both of which would also have been very helpful for Temnospondyls.
Yep. But we don't actually know what the reason for it is. They just are that way. And so it's cool that they also have a bunch of potential, but not obvious for sure this is the answer.
Yeah.
Neat.
Yeah. It's, in many ways, it is astounding how similar Temnospondyls are to crocs.
Yeah.
Or rather, how similar crocs are to Temnospondyls. Yep. You look at a Temnospondyl skull, and you could be forgiven for thinking it's just an alligator skull.
Oh, yeah. Well, like the slender snout ones you mentioned, I've seen pictures of those, and
they just look like gharials.
If you don't know, like, the specific features to look like, you could hide those in the croc section of the collections.
Yes. Now, that's a fun game. Play against. Listen, we have hidden a convergent structure among these skulls, and you have to find the one that doesn't belong.
Find the Temnospondyl.
One of these things is not like the others. Another thing that we know a fair bit about with Temnospondyls is the way that they moved, because in addition to having a bunch of soft tissue remains, there's also a bunch of trackways.
Cool.
From Temnospondyls. Footprints are known especially in Europe and Africa, from what I read and saw noted. Some of the footprints are on land, some of them are more underwater or in, partially submerged areas. A 2023 study that we talked about on the podcast described body impressions and swimming trails from a Temnospondyl in the Permian rocks from the Karoo supergroup, episode 208. Probably a rhinosuchid stereospondyle about 2 meters long. These tracks seem to record where it rested on the bottom and then swam for a little bit and then rested again, which seems to show that they not only were hopping around on the bottom of this body of water, like crocs will sometimes do, but also that they were swimming mostly with the tail, with the legs pulled up next to the body. Also how crocs swim around.
Yeah. They are so much the first not crocs.
Yes.
And it's awesome.
There's another example from Lesotho, Triassic-aged tracks of a 3.5-meter long temnospondyl that shows a sprawling posture of the limbs and the body drag mark, that it was pulling itself along the ground, mainly using the front limbs.
Ooh.
Which is interesting, because most tetrapods, on-land locomotion is pushing with the back legs. This seems to have been much more of a front limb, like literally dragging itself along the ground.
Interesting.
Which I saw researchers note that could be that the center of mass of the body was shifted forward because of its giant head.
Yeah.
That you had to support the front of the body.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because I was about to say the belly crawl, but that's not how crocs move.
No, it's not.
So that's a very interesting visual as well.
Speaking of crocs, another thing that's interesting is that sort of dragging itself along the ground seems to be an exception. Most of the time when we find temnospondyle trackways, they have tail drag marks, but not body drag marks, which suggests that at least the terrestrial ones, when they were walking around, were holding the body up off the ground.
Yeah.
Like crocs do.
Yeah. Doing subversion of the high walk.
Yes, that's what I have here. They were high walking like crocs do. So they also moved around in a bunch of different ways that were very croc-like.
When it's also, these are all such fun and good reminders of that they weren't just big salamanders living next to the water. They were competent land dwellers.
Yes.
And that's also something I had never categorized them as in my head. I knew there were members that were, but I thought those were like the exception.
Yeah, no, a bunch of, before reptiles and synapsids came around, this is the major group that was doing the land tetrapod stuff.
So cool.
Temnospondyls were generally carnivorous.
Yup.
Many of them are thought to have been fish eaters. In fact, there are a bunch of examples of gut contents with fish remains inside the guts. They were likely, some of them also eating other small tetrapods. So
obviously.
Smaller amphibians. Many of them, unsurprisingly, are thought to have hunted like crocs do.
Yep.
Hanging out in the shallow water, either eating stuff in the water, like a lot of crocs do, or grabbing stuff along the shore. They are shaped a great way to be able to do that. Terrestrial species tend to have stronger skulls in general for holding on to prey on land. Although this varies. One paper I saw noted that Nigerpaton has a very powerful skull and was probably a top predator in its ecosystem. But Chenoprosopus has the terrestrial shape of skull and jaws, but on the weaker side, and was probably eating softer bodied prey.
Yeah.
And then some smaller species are thought to have been insect eaters. So even on the terrestrial side of things, you had a lot of variation. And then in the aquatic groups, you had the sort of gator-shaped snouts. Multiple groups of aquatic temnospondyls convergently evolved long, slender snouts like gharials.
Yeah.
Specifically, aquatic temnospondyls, the ones that were spending most of their time in the water. These skulls are weaker than the robust land-dwelling chompy skulls, but are thought to have been more agile.
Yep.
It's easier to move that head around back and forth to grab fast-moving prey like fish.
Yes. Which is also the interpretation for a lot of the longirostrine, the slender snout crocodilians.
Yep. And other long-snouted reptiles of the past.
Like the toothed whales we talked about that had
Yes.
super long, skinny snouts.
But there were also temnospondyls doing things that are not analogous with croc stuff. Some brachiosaur temnospondyls have gill features that suggest filter feeding.
Ooh.
Which is very interesting. And the plagiosaurs, those bottom-dwelling on lakes and stuff, I've seen a couple of papers mention that the shape of the mouth and the throat bones is most similar to suction-feeding fish.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping you were going to say.
Yep.
Even more like the Matamata.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Like it has that special throat bones to open it up and inhale fish.
There is a plagiosaur named Garothorax that I saw. There's been some research that has found that the muscle attachments around the jaws indicate strong jaw opening muscles and also muscles that would shift the throat bones back.
Wow.
Because suction feeding is all about widening the space inside the mouth quickly to force water to flood into it.
Yes.
And then you draw in whatever fish or whatever you want to eat.
You create a vacuum by opening quickly, and mass has to fill it in.
Yes. So it seems like at least one group of Temnospondyls were suction feeding specialists, which is not a thing that crocs do, but as you pointed out, is a thing that some turtles do.
Yeah.
And the plagiosaurs are the ones with hanging out on the bottom with armor plating all over their backs. So these were not shaped like turtles, but they had that very short face like turtles do. So there's a lot of turtle going on.
I mean, they did a lot of things. The armored lake dwellers and shoreline ambush predators. They did a lot of things first.
Speaking of diet, this is an important point for me to mention. In several episodes of this podcast, I have mentioned one of my absolute favorite snake fossils, which is a fossil from the Messelpit in Germany, which is a paleopython. I think it may be Eoconstrictor now, but it's a big python-like snake that has the remains of a lizard inside of its gut, and the lizard has the remains of a bug. And it is a 3-in-1 Russian nesting doll fossil. It was not the first. I've mentioned this before, but I've never brought up the details. The first time that a fossil preserving 3 trophic levels was discovered, it was published in a 2007 publication from Permian Fossils, also in Germany. It is a shark named Triotis, and inside the belly are 2 juvenile Temnospondyls, Achagosaurus and Cheliderpaton has a partial fish inside its gut. This was the first time that this happened. It also proved a little bit of who was eating Temnospondyls and what Temnospondyls were eating.
Yes.
The paper actually noted that this is the first time a juvenile Temnospondyl was found with that kind of fish in its guts, which previously we thought only the adults were eating those fish.
Cool.
Very cool stuff. Another feature, so now taking it away from turtles and crocs and moving back to modern amphibians, one of the defining features of Temnospondyls, like when you look at the skull, you go, that's a Temnospondyl, is that the roof of the mouth has these 2 giant holes in it.
Yes.
These are called interpterygoid vacuities. They are, between the pterygoid bones. Other tetrapods rarely have this feature. They have those holes sometimes, but they tend to be much smaller.
Yes.
But modern amphibians have them. And the reason that these holes in modern amphibians are nice and big is because they have to fit the eyeballs.
Yep.
Yeah. There are muscles that attach around those holes in the roof of the mouth that pull the eyeballs down into the mouth cavity to help them swallow.
Yes, that's what helps push it back.
Yes. It physically pushes food down the throat. So when you watch a frog or a salamander eat, or sometimes when they're breathing, they'll use that to pump air through the body. Their eyes literally sink into the skull.
Yeah, because I mean, that's how they blink, so to speak.
Yeah.
They have to recess the eyes. So what it looks like when you watch a frog eat is they grab the food and then it looks like they struggled because they have to squint their eyes to swallow it. What they're doing is pushing their eyes into the mouth to push the food down the throat.
Yes, which is a truly wild thing,
right,
for an animal to have to do.
That's right up there with licking your eyeball.
That's when we moved out of the water, and it's easy to swallow food in the water because you suction feed and you just right down the throat. But you get on land and you have to find new techniques. And some animals went, I'll just tilt my head back and gravity will do the work. And some animals went, I've got an idea. I have these other organs up here that aren't really doing much.
Yeah. Whenever I blink, what are they doing now?
What are they doing? They're not even doing anything. Temnospondyls seem to have had similar muscle attachments in those holes in the roof of the mouth.
I was wondering.
I did see a note that in many species, those gaps also seem to attach to jaw muscles.
Cool.
So they might not have only been moving the eyes, like in modern amphibians. And in some Temnospondyls, the eyes were in the wrong place to be able to move like that. So this wasn't universal, but at least some Temnospondyls probably pulled their eyes into their mouth to help with swallowing or breathing.
Yeah. Well, because I also wondered that about if it would translate, because at least in my mind, when I think of a Temnospondyl skull, the eyes aren't as honkin' big as they are for like frogs and salamanders.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure if they would be as useful. So it's interesting that there were other attachments, because this might have started with other purposes and frogs adapted it to use that way.
Yeah. I saw a note that in many Temnospondyls, it seemed the holes seemed to have been dual purpose. They were moving the eyes, they were doing jaw muscles. In some groups, specifically, I think this was in the Disaurophoroids, the eyes and the vacuities in the roof of the mouth had a very close size relationship.
Oh.
That if one changed size, the other one did too.
That's cool.
That suggests that they were probably primarily using those holes for recessing the eyes.
Neat.
Which is very cool stuff.
Ah.
All of this paints a really fascinating picture of what it would be like to watch a Temnospondyl and to just like a little scaly, big-headed weirdo that lives kind of like a croc and kind of like a turtle, but blinks like a frog.
Yes.
Very cool.
Yes.
Now, speaking of things that amphibians do, and this is maybe my favorite part of what we have learned about Temnospondyls through their fossil record, because we have Will smiling at me because I think he knows where this is going. Because we have so many well-preserved fossils of Temnospondyls, we have a lot of species where we know the entire growth series from young to adults, and thanks to that, we know that many Temnospondyls went through metamorphosis.
Yes!
We have extensive fossils showing us how Temnospondyls metamorphosed over the course of their life. Metamorphosis is very famous in amphibians today, among other groups. Episode 181 for metamorphosis. Also episode 91 for frogs, which I haven't mentioned yet. Also episode 162 for Sicilians, who aren't really relevant, but they're amphibians. Metamorphosis is the process by which you start out basically as one kind of creature, and then at some point you become an adult, which is a different kind of creature.
Yep.
Tadpole to frog, larva to adult insect, or whatnot. Not all Temnospondyls metamorphosed.
Okay.
There are a bunch where we have growth series and it's just the juvenile is just a little version of the adult. A lot of basal groups, like the early members of the group, did not metamorphose, it seems. And stereospondyls, the really popular Triassic group, generally were not metamorphosing.
Interesting.
Yeah, so this is like an in-between thing. In some, we see terrestrial adults and aquatic larvae.
Yeah.
So as juveniles, they were aquatic. This is the case for things like Eriops, which is a famous terrestrial, stocky, robust, land-walking Temnospondyl. In these metamorphosing groups, we see changes to the body structure from larva to adult. The limbs become generally more robust and stronger and well built. Changes to the nostrils and the ear bones correlate with having to sense things in a different environment. Juveniles often have that lateral line groove that is then lost in the adults as they move on to land. Certain gill components will be lost. Features of external gills, for example, will be lost in the adults. This is, in many cases, we're not talking metamorphosis like frogs, but like salamanders.
Yeah.
Like salamanders go through metamorphosis where they start out as a swimming salamander and develop into a walking salamander.
Yes. Which is, it's very interesting both that they did metamorphose, but not all of them did,
Mm-hmm.
and that it doesn't seem like they started out doing that.
Yeah.
Because that was going to be one of my comments was like, it makes sense because like most fish metamorphose. So like, yeah, it's, but no.
No. This seems to be something that they picked up later.
Yeah, that they developed.
And then their most successful group dropped it.
Yeah.
Stereospondylus weren't doing it.
So
Now,
weird.
Stereospondylus were almost exclusively aquatic.
Yeah, so they may not have needed
they
to transition.
didn't need to do that. Another interesting feature, and now we're talking more salamandery, some Temnospondyls could metamorphose and didn't.
Oh.
Brachiosaurs, one of the groups within Disaurophoroids, are especially famous for this. This was a small salamander-like aquatic group. Adult brachiosaurs hold on to the juvenile features. So we compare these to other Temnospondyls, the features that normally would be lost as they became adults, this group, almost across the board, keeps them. This is a feature we see a lot in modern salamanders called neoteny.
Yes.
That is, a salamander has the option that some salamanders will transition from the aquatic larva to a land-walking adult, but in the right conditions, some of them just won't. They will achieve maturity, they will become fully adult, but hold on to their gills and their fins and their larval body shape. This is neoteny. In these brachiosaurs, looking at the histology within the bones, episode 210, we can see which ones are adults, but they still look like juveniles.
Cool.
Many brachiosaurs, it seems, started out as filter feeders, and then as adults stayed in the water but became more carnivorous. They lost those gill features of filter feeding. Brachiosaurs are interesting because whereas a lot of modern salamanders are sometimes neotenic, they can, or sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, there are almost no adult-shaped brachiosaurs known.
Yeah.
They were obligatory neotenic animals.
Which, if my knowledge is correct, makes them more like an axolotl.
Yes.
Where, like, that is how axolotls grow up. They don't have an option. They always just stay fully aquatic with external gills.
They just become big babies.
Yep.
One paper noted that this makes Brachiosaur temnospondyls perhaps the only well-known example of this outside of salamanders.
Cool.
That this is one of the only cases we have of a group that does this.
Fantastic.
It's so cool. They're so cool. Once Temnospondyls grew up, some groups, the adult form would vary. They had different versions of adults. So in Brachiosaurs, that we were just talking about, there were morphs, so different anatomy, for species that lived in streams versus ponds, which we also see in salamanders today. Modern salamanders, I believe the stream-type salamanders will have shorter gills and shorter fins, and we see very similar things with brachiosaurs.
Cool.
There is a temnospondyl genus named Sclerocephalus, which was a big one. This is about 1.5 meters, moderately sized. Most of the time, adult Sclerocephalus are clearly aquatic. They've got all the aquatic features, but in fossil deposits that were smaller lakes, we see adults that lose their lateral line and develop stronger limbs and become terrestrial. So it's the same species. You can have terrestrial adults in one lake and aquatic adults in another lake.
Cool.
I saw this noted in a Micromelerpaton, which were little newt-like forms, had smaller adults in some habitats and larger ones in others. A Pation, which is another member of this small aquatic group, one paper noted that in smaller lake deposits, they will retain filter feeding as adults. And in other places, the adults will transition to carnivory. So that's a version of neoteny that is facultative.
Yes.
Which is sometimes they do it. They do it if they need to, but they don't have to do it. So much like modern amphibians, especially like salamanders, temnospondyls, not only could they metamorphose, not only were there some that didn't, but they had different adult modes.
Yeah.
Which is a thing that we don't get in a lot of modern animals, but amphibians are really good at doing that. Fish do that too. You'll get fish that absolutely are very variable as adults.
So cool. And like it makes complete sense because if it's useful for are modern salamanders, and these are very salamander-esque. They're living in similar environments. They're going through a similar life cycle. Makes perfect sense. Very cool to know that it was happening that long ago.
Yeah, well, and it's also extremely cool to see that in the fossil record. That we have these wonderful lake deposits where it's like, yeah, here's 100 of this species from young to adult, and the young look different from the adults, and the adults in this deposit look different from the adults in that deposit, that these were extremely malleable.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a fascinating phenomenon for us because we're mammals, and most of the animals that we're familiar with are reptiles or birds who can't do that kind of thing.
Yep.
Right? That's, in mammals, the closest we really get to stuff like that is sexual dimorphism.
Yes.
But the idea that you can just be a different shape depending on the habitat you grow. Well, this lake was a little smaller than it could have been, so I grew into a land-dwelling adult with big old legs and no gills. But my cousin in the next lake over, which was big enough and had lots of food, stayed aquatic. That's a really remarkable feature that fish can do and amphibians can do, and probably a lot of invertebrates can do it.
Yes.
I assume insects are doing that all the time. And it's fascinating to get that not only were these ancient animals doing it, but these were the most successful land-dwelling vertebrates in the late Paleozoic, and that's how a lot of them lived.
Yeah. It also gives the really cool image of like a lake. You know, if we were to have lived back then and had our house next to the lake, that you could have had a lake, and if it started to dry up, then once it got small enough, after one breeding season for them, all of a sudden a bunch of them start leaving the lake.
Yes.
And you're like, you've never done this before. What's happening? What are you?
They all become toads and start wandering out to find another lake.
Where did these animals come from?
Yes. One last thing that is important to note about Temnospondyls that I have been teasing this whole episode, which is the link between Temnospondyls and Amphibia. Modern amphibians, frogs, episode 91, Sicilians, episode 162, salamanders, episode pending, are grouped into one clade, one group called Amphibia. In both the frogs and the Sicilians episode, we talked a bit about the origins of these groups, and we have mentioned the fact that we are not quite certain where amphibians actually got started. Temnospondyls are thought to be likely ancestors, but it is not totally clear, and it is not totally agreed upon. Over and over again, I would read papers about Temnospondyls, and it would say, the general consensus is that Temnospondyls are probably the ancestors of amphibians. Parentheses, see these other papers for alternative ideas.
Yep.
All the papers said that. So this is something that is actively still being worked on. There have been a bunch of different versions of this relationship hypothesized over time. One old, now outdated idea was that frogs are descended from Temnospondyls, but salamanders and Sicilians were descended from Lepospondylus, the group that has Diplocaulus. This is outdated by this point because our more recent evidence shows us that frogs and salamanders are closer related to each other than they are to Sicilians, so they must have come from the same place outside of Sicilians. Some fossils have been proposed to link Sicilians to Lepospondylus, and frogs and salamanders might have come from Temnospondyls. These days, the general consensus is that all three groups came from the same ancestors, probably among Temnospondyls. But even then, where among Temnospondyls is also up in the air. Typically, they are linked to Disorphoroids. So that's the group that I've been mentioning a few times that had some of the land-dwelling toad-like members, including the one with the sail, but also the brachiosaurs and the micromelarptotids, which were newt and salamander-like, some of them that were neotenic, retaining their juvenile forms. That group is the Disorphoroids. Researchers have noted that a lot of the Temnospondyls in those group have a lot of features of the teeth and the vertebrae that are very similar to modern amphibians. That they have pedicellate teeth. For more on what that means, go listen to the frogs episode, because I don't remember. Some Temnospondyls have particularly frog-like features of the skull, the ears, the eyes. So that's the group that most likely is linked to modern amphibians, although there has been disagreement. There was a study in 2023 that we talked about on the podcast, and I think also in the Sicilians episode, a fossil named Chinle stegophus, which is a stereospondyle, was argued to be linked to Sicilians.
Gotcha. Right. I remember that now.
Which would suggest that Sicilians came from one group of Temnospondyls and frogs and salamanders came from the other one. But that has also been debated and argued that it's a stereospondyle, but it's not actually linked to Sicilians. So there's a lot of uncertainty with this has gone back and forth. What seems to be happening over time is that all of these hypotheses are gradually collapsing down to all amphibians today are disorophoroids. That there seems to be a consensus is sort of gradually coming together, but it doesn't seem like there are many researchers who are willing to say that's it for sure.
Yeah.
This is still a source of uncertainty. This is also fascinating because if they're descended from disorophoroids, that means that our modernless amphibians are descended from arguably the weirdest group. Not the one that was most successful.
Yeah.
It's not the stereospondyls who were kicking butt in the Triassic. It's this group of tiny weirdos that developed in the Permian and had their little axolotl-like members and all the... That might be the origin of our modern little weirdos.
Well, I had the exact same thought, which is kind of fitting because amphibians are an odd group and makes sense for them to come from an odd group.
Well, it also makes a lot of sense to think about it that all of the other groups of Temnospondyls were doing things that they were directly competing with more successful groups.
Yeah.
Right? The terrestrial lineages disappeared after the Permian because all of the amniotes came in and did what they were doing better. Even the stereospondyls were very successful in the Triassic, but after the end Triassic extinction shook up all the ecosystems, all the things stereospondyls were doing were then occupied by croc cousins and marine reptiles and turtles.
Yep.
It does make some amount of intuitive sense that the disorophoroids who were being weird could capitalize on their niche and then eventually become frogs and stuff.
Sometimes it's beneficial to go against the grain.
Yes! Temnospondyls, absolutely fascinating group of early animals. I'm very happy that we got to do this episode because I didn't know very much about Temnospondyls.
Oh yeah, I learned a ton.
And I knew about them generally.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know how much cool stuff there was. The most exciting moment for me preparing for this episode was when I found multiple papers focused on Temnospondyl metamorphosis. And I said, this is going to be a super cool episode.
Yep. They're just fun.
Listeners, I hope you also have gained a new appreciation for these early weird land-dwelling tetrapods. Well, a lot of them are aquatic. Before we wrap everything up, there is one more thing to do, and that is answer a patron question. One of the benefits that our patrons can get in return for supporting us kindly on Patreon is the ability to submit questions for us to answer here on the podcast. Will read the patron question, please.
Happily. This question is from Dr. Nanjo, who asks, is there any evidence of marine reptiles or marine stem mammals existing in the late Permian?
That is a really interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
Marine reptiles really hit it big in the Mesozoic.
Mm-hmm.
Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, marine crocodiles. Marine mammals are really big now.
Yes.
Right? We've got whales, we've got pinnipeds and stuff. But what about before that?
Mm-hmm.
This is a fascinating... I did a bit of a dive into this, and I thought this was fun because we were just talking about aquatic things, and Temnospondyls will come up again here in a second. This is a fascinating question because the answer is kind of no.
Yeah.
There is one group of, for sure, marine reptiles in the Permian, and it is the species within the genus Mesosaurus. This is early Permian, not late Permian, which is what Dr. Nanjo asked. This is early Permian. They don't make it past the early Permian as far as we can tell. They are found in South America and Africa. These are either early reptiles or near the earliest reptiles. These are marine. They are found in the open ocean deposits. They have long skulls with needle-like teeth, long necks, webbed feet, long tails, dense bones, all of the open ocean adaptations. They are the oldest known secondarily aquatic amniotes.
Oh.
As far as the other marine reptiles, there isn't direct evidence for them in the Permian, but the earliest fossils of the ichthyosaur lineage are apparently fully open ocean remains from the very earliest Triassic. There are some that go as early as only 2 million years or so after the end Permian, which suggests that they might have become aquatic before the Permian extinction, because that's not a lot of time to change into that. Similarly, there is a reptile named Hanosaurus from the earliest Triassic, which is a basal member of the group Sauropterigiformes, which eventually goes on to include plesiosaurs and placodonts and other marine reptiles. Found in marine sediments, long slender body, short limbs, dense vertebrae, very shortly into the Triassic. So phylogenetic analysis of both of these groups suggests that there is a good chance that their earliest aquatic ancestors were in the Permian.
Yeah.
But we don't actually have fossils of them from the Permian.
So it's either very fast evolution or we're missing some ancestors.
Yes. Synapsids were not aquatic. In fact, so synapsids, the lineage that leads to mammals, there are apparently no aquatic synapsids known from either the Permian or the Triassic.
All right.
There are some swimming mammal, like beaver-like mammals from later in the Mesozoic, but synapsids did not go into the water. So the answer to Dr. Nanjo's question, were there marine reptiles in the late Permian? Maybe. We have reason to think that there might have been.
It would make sense.
Mesosaurs were gone already, it seems, by the late Permian. But also, since we just did a whole episode about these temnospondyle amphibians, I thought it was interesting to point out that even temnospondyls didn't get marine until the Triassic. A lot of those temnospondyls were coastal, so you have shallow ocean, lagoons and stuff like that. But the only group that was open ocean adapted were the traumadosaurs, which were in the Triassic. That's another group that researchers have noticed seem to have been very diverse and very widespread by the early part of the Triassic. So they might also have gotten started in the Permian. So there is this discussion to be had of, did marine reptiles and these marine temnospondyls successfully radiate after the Permian extinction, or were they survivors of the extinction that then were able to diversify? What seems very likely happened is that the Permian extinction messed up ocean ecosystems a bunch, especially among fish and sharks and things, and cleared room for both reptiles and temnospondyls to start filling in those open ocean niches.
Yeah, it's both scenarios make sense, especially after the Permian.
Yeah, if anything's going to change how an ecosystem functions.
Going to clear the way for you. It's the one that almost cleared the way completely.
Episode 45.
So it makes sense that there could be some surprisingly rapid evolution after that. But in most scenarios, when we see something like this, it's pretty safe to assume that there's an ancestor that goes on a bit further back, because usually we don't see this evolution that quickly.
It's fascinating to think that tetrapods made it onto land around the middle of the Paleozoic and were in the water, but that ocean-dwelling tetrapods really wasn't a thing until after the Paleozoic.
Yeah.
Which is, except for that one group. So that one genus that apparently was swimming around in the oceans. Fascinating. Just incredible trends in the history of our planet.
Yeah.
Dr. Nanja, thank you very much for that patron question. Listeners, if you have enjoyed this discussion and you would like to learn more, check out the blog post. We will post some links for more information and also a bunch of pictures. There's going to be a bunch of cool pictures of temnospondyl skulls and things like that.
Yeah.
Big thanks to all of the people who requested this episode topic. Thank you very much. This was a ton of fun. Extra thanks to our patrons for their support. If you would like to support us, you can go to our Patreon. You can find the link in the episode description. We much appreciate it. Extra thanks to our top patrons, Jeff Ellington, Danielle the Bug Lover, and Sarah May. There's a lot of cool stuff happening with Common Descent these days. If you didn't listen to the last episode, 211, we talked with our guest Astrid Lundberg about Edward Drinker Cope. It was a riot. Go listen to that.
So much fun.
If you haven't been on our YouTube channel recently, go watch Will build a bunch of stuff with Lego on Bricks with Basque, which by now, 2 episodes are out. The second episode, I really enjoyed. That build is very fun.
It made me happy.
Our listener survey is still up. It'll be up until around mid-March, so if you haven't filled out the listener survey, go check it out. Also, at the end of March, we are going to be at ETS Yukon in Johnson City, Tennessee, doing some presentations. And the day before that, on Saturday, March 29th, we're going to be doing a meetup with our fans at the Gray Fossil Site and Museum. If you are interested in joining that meetup, let us know. Hop in the Discord and get on the meetup channel so that we have some idea of how many people we can expect.
Yeah.
It's exciting times.
It's so cool.
Here at Common Descent, we got a lot of cool stuff going on. Listeners, as always, thank you for engaging. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sending in requests. Thank you for supporting us and all the things that we do, either on Patreon or just with your lovely sentiments in emails and things. We release episodes every fortnight. Every one. And we'll have another one in another fortnight, episode 213 or whatever. Stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
Something about amphibians.
Yeah, something
Not
witty.
the episode. The episode won't be about
No.
213. No, we're going to take a break.
That insert phrase here that is a quippy and clever reference to the episode.
Absolutely. Water and eye breathing. Cutaneous respiration. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.